Welcome to the vMOX Road to Mobile Victory podcast. Enterprise mobility is bigger and more complicated than ever. In this series, we'll talk about the latest trends, inspiring success stories, and simple and effective tips for managing your corporate mobile assets, expenses, and services. Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Andrea Leiby, Director of Marketing here at vMOX. In today's episode, we're going to talk about smoothly migrating your mobility projects to a different vendor and the do's and don'ts of onboarding. We'll chat about how you can maximize onboarding efficiency while also minimizing your costs and risks to the business and avoiding any disruptions to your end users. Joining me today is Greta Humbert-Mortley, vMOX Director of Operations. Welcome.
Hi, glad to be here.
So I know you're a first-time guest, but I'd like to begin with a fun question, and this allows us to get to know you a little bit better, especially your first time on the show. I did see that the latest list of emojis hit iPhones as part of the iOS 7, or I should say iOS 16.4 release, which get ready, the slow clap, we now have a wireless emoji. So very, very exciting news for our industry. What's the most used emoji on your phone?
I probably like the moose head the most.
Moose head.
The moose head, yeah. It's a new one as well. Cool as a moose.
Nice.
That's all I'll say.
I think for me, it's probably, I have a lot of sarcastic back and forth, I guess, with my friends and family. So for me, it's the tongue out, the laughing emoji. I like sharing memes. So for those of us that are in that world, that's my favorite. Well, good to know. Good to know. All right. Well, let's get to today's topic. You know, all businesses, no matter what size or what industry, they obviously have the right and the power to switch their managed mobility service vendors. And this usually happens at either when their contracts are expiring or when they're deciding to make decisions, let's say on value versus cost. But obviously, poor experiences, limited resources, tight budgets can hold back a lot of teams, right, from making that move. And when I look at kind of the various stages of the journey, the onboarding stage is just as critical as the selection. And I think I saw this fact the other day that said 74% of potential customers will switch actually to other solutions if they think the onboarding process is complicated, which I thought was interesting. So, you know, based on your experience, Greta, what do you think are some of those onboarding fears that you've heard? And, you know, are there certain problems or issues that can derail maybe some onboarding efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are probably a couple of different categories that come to mind. I think one big one is around mobile end user support, right? So if the migration impacts how end users are consuming mobile services, and if they have to do something different, that can cause some fears there, because we know mobility is very personal, right?
Yes.
So that's always something to be aware of, and make sure that when it is impacting end users, that we're really communicating very clearly with that customer or with that end user group, and making sure they know what's happening and know what to expect. I think another one is probably around timelines. I think that can create some, I don't know that I would say fear, but maybe pressure, right? If you have a tight timeline for migrating the solution, again, that can create some pressure on both sides, right? On the customer as well as the solution provider. I think key there is that, you know, as long as you have a good project plan in place and have the right resources that are supporting the project, I think that can still be, that shouldn't be a concern really, right? Even tight timelines can be managed as long as requirements are defined. And again, communication is taking place along the way, and everybody involved can provide the right level of support for the project. I think one thing there is too, right, especially when it comes to tight timelines, it might also be something where a customer might need to consider, you know, what are the things that I need to have, what are my must-haves for, you know, getting this solution off the ground in the next 4 weeks, right? Because there are must-haves and there are nice-to-haves, right? And knowing those and the difference, I think, is a critical piece in making an implementation or a migration a success.
Sort of like buying a house.
Sort of like buying a house. Yes, exactly. Yep. I think one of the challenges we have also seen is around, when customers buy a solution, sometimes the buyer is different from who gets to implement the solution.
True.
And if there is misalignment there, that can definitely delay an implementation and cause challenges for both sides. So for the customer, making sure that even during the sales process, all the stakeholders on the customer side, everybody that has to touch the solution ultimately is involved, is aware of what's happening, is a key piece to make sure that the migration and the implementation are a success and can be done in a timely manner. I think lastly, I guess I would probably say that one of the challenges we have seen is if there are too many stakeholders involved, and it almost can lead to paralysis, right? There's too many cooks in the kitchen, and it just causes significant delays in some cases. So really, a large project team is not a bad thing. But even for a large project team, having that single final decision maker that can make decisions and ensure the project and the tasks move forward is a critical piece.
Yeah, it reminds me of kids, those toddler soccer games where everyone's running for the ball. There's no real point person. It's just everyone running after the ball and trying to get it. So it definitely makes sense.
Yep.
I think a poor onboarding can lead to a lot of unhappy, frustrated teams. And I know there isn't a single vendor or supplier out there that wants that outcome. But we've seen companies have success, including ourselves, right? And, you've been with other companies, you've kind of seen it all. Can you walk us through some success stories that you've seen, especially in mobility and telecom? What was right? How did it go?
I think to me, the success there comes down to what I mentioned a little bit earlier as well, is requirements, right? Really the customer and the solution provider working on those requirements upfront, documenting them, agreeing them, knowing what the end goal is ultimately, and those requirements not changing along the way. That's a big piece to making sure it's successful. Understanding, especially in the case of a migration, where a customer is coming from another solution provider, understanding that this new solution might accomplish something in a different way, right? So being flexible in how you go about implementing some of these processes while the outcome is still the same. I think that's another key to success. And not trying to force, something, I'm used to this process and it working this way, and not forcing that into a solution if it's not built that way. And again, being open to adjusting things with the outcome still being the same. I think that's a really important piece that if customers have that flexibility, that makes it a lot easier. I think one of the examples, I guess, that comes to mind recently, we implemented a very large and complex customer late last year. They had a very tight deadline in migrating their solution from a current provider to us, and we were able to make it happen within a few weeks. But I think we were very closely aligned. We knew it required total focus, consistent communication, negotiation, and understanding of the other party's needs, and really being able, honestly, there were some concessions that we had to make on both sides too, right? So, but again, as long as you have those requirements and can work with a customer, everybody can dedicate the right amount of time to the project and making this a true partnership ultimately, then I think that will lead to success of the project ultimately.
Yeah, I agree.
The last part that I wanted to point out here, I think, is around, and I mentioned that a little bit already too, but I think, sometimes customers again, somebody signs a contract, right? And somebody else has to support the implementation of the solution. And we know there are, many things that are going on for a customer. Mobility is not this team's primary focus that now has to implement this solution, right?
Yeah.
But somebody being able to dedicate the right amount of time to implementing the solution is key.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, right? I mean, while the solution provider can do a lot of the heavy lifting, there are decisions that need to be made along the way. There are some tasks that are on the customer, and those need to be made in a timely fashion. Otherwise, you're going to see, project timelines being dragged out into several months rather than being able to get something completed within 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah, I think you need a champion, someone who can, really champion it through the organization and understand what, the outcome is and, what it takes to get there. So I definitely agree. Now, there no two implementations are the same, right? And having the right partner, the right processes in place and preparations can make a world of difference. And you kind of talked about some of that. And, some of the industry will say it's part science, part art. But what are some things, I guess, in your opinion, teams can do to prepare, right? Especially their stakeholders and their users, maybe people that aren't normally touching this type of project or maybe aren't going to be as involved, but do have some level of effort needed from those teams. What would be your suggestions?
Yeah, I think any feedback that customers can share especially when they're coming from a current solution provider, right? Any feedback that they have of what they liked, what they didn't like, what has worked, what hasn't worked, right? That way we can avoid some of those pitfalls and are aware of them, right? So that we can make sure again we don't go down the same path. So if they have lists like that, if they have gotten feedback from end users along the way about the solution or from the team managing the solution, that's always great input on how to start the kickoff. Back to requirements, I guess I can't stress requirements enough. Having those, documented, knowing what you want, knowing what's a must-have, knowing what's a nice-to-have, and being able to communicate that to the solution provider is key as well. And then, really important, especially in the case of, a mobility management solution, is being able to help with the execution of carrier agreements like LOAs and anything a solution provider might need to get access to the customer's carrier information. That can be a lengthy process, and being on top of that, knowing who might need to sign paperwork like that will definitely help. So if customers can come prepared with that information, that's very helpful.
Yeah. On a related note, onboarding can't move forward with some of the data pieces. But those kind of the two words data migration is a heartache and can cause a lot of IT professionals to kind of break out in a sweat. What tips do you have to ensure fast and smooth data migrations?
Data migration, that's a great question. And I don't think customers really need to sweat data migration. So the reason I say that, let's talk about the different data pieces that we need to set up a mobility solution. So most importantly, carrier information. Having access to carrier portals to retrieve invoice information, inventory information, and usage information is critical. The next data piece is typically like employee-related information, which would come from a customer's HR system. So being able to set up a feed there out of the customer system to us so that we have the employees and can tie employees to mobile lines of service. That's the other data piece. And then I'd say the third piece would be financial information related to the employees so that we also can support reporting the other way, which would allow us to do financial reporting, chargeback type of reporting back to the customer's financial system. So, charge coding, cost centers, GL codes, and things like that. So those would really be the data pieces that we need from the customer so that we can then in turn also feed data back to the customer for, again, chargebacks or paying carrier invoices and things like that. The other piece to that would be an optional piece would be access to or a feed from an MDM system where we can also retrieve device and device related information. And we can also receive the kind of the linkage between the phone line to the employee from an MDM system. So that's another option. And then last but not least, another data feed that we can set up depending on the customer's requirements would be around what does the customer want to have back, right? So for example, we could set up an inventory feed to update a customer's ITSM solution with inventory data that we have. So those are really the main data pieces that kind of go back and forth between the customer and the mobility management solution provider. I hope that helps. And like I said, I don't think there's a need to break into sweat around data migrations. I think we can keep it pretty simple there.
Good. So, for some people, you might be outsourcing all of your mobility management functions, or in some cases, just a portion of them. Whether it's one or the other, you're most likely working with a third party. But finding kind of that right fit for your own mobility vision can, I think, be tricky for most people. In your perspective, what key questions do you think customers should be asking their vendors and suppliers before they sign, right? What should they take into consideration when they're looking at all the different potential partners out there?
I think that's a great question. I think there's probably several things that come to mind, right, that will help in preparation. I think, knowing your mobile fleet, right? Mm-hmm. How large is your mobile fleet? How many carriers do you have? Is it just United States, or is it carriers across the globe, right? Is it domestic versus international? And how large are the fleet sizes for those countries and carriers? The more information you have there, the easier it will make. The easier it will be for the solution provider to make sure they can come up with a project plan that allows for the implementation of that in the most effective way. Knowing what the device makeup is for your environment, right? Do you have a lot of smartphones? Do you have equal amount of smartphones versus tablets? Do you also use MiFis or machine-to-machine devices? So knowing that in device mix is important too, and very helpful information to provide to the solution provider. Requirements around, knowing your mobile policy. What kind of requirements do you have there as far as the policy goes? Do you have requirements around upgrading the technology every couple of years to make sure employees have some of the most current technology when they're using their smartphones? So having those policies is very helpful. Understanding who the stakeholders will be that will be involved in the program, right? We talked about stakeholders before, and knowing those, who they are and who will be involved is critical. As far as onboarding, what are you looking for, right? Are you looking for a standard approach, or are you looking for something more customized? And I think there's solutions out there where you're going to be, more like a small fish in a large pond, yeah. or do you want to have a customized solution, customized implementation that is really tailored to your needs?
Yeah. And I think there's a fit for everyone out there, right? And it's not always going to be the perfect match, but at least knowing up front whether or not your supplier or vendor can support you in those areas, then I think it probably prevents a lot of heartache down the road after, you find out you do need international support, but maybe they don't provide it, or vice versa.
Absolutely. Yep.
So I think every year we see companies investing more and more in managed services and enterprise grade software. And, we talked about this before. Mobile devices are personal. They're a lot of times professional lifelines, especially for some industries. And that's why I think, having a streamlined and effective onboarding can really go a long way in ensuring a positive user experience, laying that foundation for long-term success, which you talked about. And, we all want to make sure it's done right, but also quickly, right? No one wants to extend out and have a 2-year implementation. So all those tips and tricks you gave were really helpful. And I'm glad we were able to kind of chat about it today. Thank you again for joining me, and hopefully we continue this conversation another time.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. From all of us here at vMOX, thank you for listening. Remember, mobile victory can be yours. Just trust in the experts. We'll see you next time on the road to mobile victory. To learn more, visit us at vmox.com or follow us on LinkedIn.